My name is Amanda Simmons. I'm 28 years old, and right now, every camera in this cafe is pointed at my sister. Balloons hang from the ceiling, a ribbon stretches across the counter, and she is mid-sentence about dreams coming true. I step forward, set a crisp file and a pen between us, and meet her eyes. My voice is calm, almost casual. I'm your new landlord. Sarah's smile freezes. My mother goes still. The room doesn't breathe, but the cameras keep rolling. Before I tell you how we got here, tell me where you are listening from. I read every single comment. And if you enjoy family revenge stories like this one, make sure you subscribe and switch on notifications. This is the full breakdown, every step, every receipt, every twist. I learned early that being the firstborn daughter in my family did not mean being the favorite. It meant being the trial run. I was praised for being helpful more than for being curious or creative. Helpful was the gold star of my childhood, the only one I could reliably earn. My days often revolved around the moods of others. If Sarah, my younger sister, was cranky, I was expected to distract her. If my mother was in one of her sharp-tongued moods, I was supposed to stay close enough to help, but far enough not to irritate her. My father's silences were puzzles I had to solve without clues. Birthdays never really felt like mine. If I wanted a moment for myself, there was always a speech about being mature, about understanding that Sarah was still little and needed more attention. I understood so well that by the time I was 10, I could predict how much of a celebration I might get based on the week's household tension. When Sarah had a minor win, getting picked for a school play, finishing a reading project, our kitchen became a parade ground. Cameras, cake, congratulations from every direction. When I brought home an art piece I had worked on for weeks, the response was a distracted, "That's nice. Could you help Sarah with her lines?" Over time, I learned that service equaled safety. If I anticipated needs and met them before being asked, I could avoid criticism. But safety was not the same as value. It was a transaction. I gave time, patience, and energy, and in return, I was spared from being a problem. I kept a quiet, private tally of what I gave up for Sarah to shine. The field trip to the science center I skipped so the money could go toward her dance recital costume. The summer art camp I didn't attend so my parents could afford her gymnastics lessons. The afternoons I spent babysitting her when I could have been drawing. I told myself it was temporary. That one day, my patience and quiet competence would be appreciated, maybe even rewarded. But the truth was harder. The more I gave, the more invisible I became. And by the time I realized it, invisibility had become my default setting. Sarah could have burned the kitchen down and still been called spirited. If I forgot to unload the dishwasher, I was careless. If Sarah missed curfew, she was finding herself. If I came home 10 minutes late, I was irresponsible. The same actions meant different things depending on who did them, and it was always tilted in her favor. Family dinners were like stage plays with Sarah as the headliner. Mom would guide the conversation toward her stories before anyone had even served the main course. My news, grades, projects, art exhibits was an afterthought tacked on before dessert, if mentioned at all. Most of the time, Mom would say, "We'll get to you in a minute," but the minute never came. Sometimes, I would sit there with something important to share, only to realize the plates were being cleared and no one had noticed I was silent the entire evening. When Sarah wanted to tell a story, everyone leaned in. She could ramble for 20 minutes about a minor misunderstanding at the coffee shop, and they would hang on every word. When I started speaking, someone would interrupt to add a detail to her version or change the subject altogether. At first, I tried to press on, but that only earned me the label of being desperate for the spotlight. Mom said that once in front of relatives, and I never forgot the sting. Arguments were pre-decided before they began. If Sarah cried, I was automatically in the wrong, no matter the facts. If she laughed, I was accused of jealousy. I became the repair crew for her consequences, no matter how large or small. I apologized to neighbors when she dented their fence. I covered the cost of her overdue library books so she would not be embarrassed. I fixed her school projects at the last minute when she forgot about them entirely. The message was constant. Sarah's mistakes were reframed as potential. Mine were signs of ingratitude or poor character. Sarah's chaos was charming, my boundaries were cold. Over time, I stopped expecting fairness. I learned that in my family's eyes, attention flowed toward spectacle. So I stripped myself of anything they could twist into drama. I became quiet, efficient, and as close to invisible as possible. But that quiet came at a cost. I watched Sarah's life fill with safety nets. Mom rushing to bail her out of fees, Dad quietly fixing her car, relatives handing her small loans that were never repaid. Meanwhile, I was expected to stand on my own. If I ever asked for help, it was met with long pauses and a reminder to be responsible. I realized that if Sarah could do no wrong in their eyes, the only way to survive was to stop playing their game entirely. What I did not realize back then was that being overlooked could one day be my greatest advantage. Eleanor's kitchen table was my refuge. It smelled faintly of lemon polish and Earl Grey tea, and it was always cluttered with sketch pads, pencils, and the occasional half-finished crossword. She never minded the mess. If anything, she encouraged it. Create first, explain later, she would say, as if the act of making something was more important than justifying it. Unlike at home, I was allowed to take up space in her house. I could leave my drawings out overnight and find them exactly as I had left them. She had a small, sturdy box tucked under her bed, my box. Inside were my sketches, my paintings, and little clay pieces I had made in school. She told me it was so she could keep my work safe, but I later learned it was also a way to show me that what I made mattered. She treated each piece like it had value, no matter how imperfect. Eleanor set aside a modest studio fund for me years before she passed. She was upfront about it, explaining that one day it would help me rent a small space where I could work without interruptions. It was not a fortune, but it was enough for a beginning. She even showed me her notes about where the money was kept and how it was to be transferred to me. She wanted me to know it was secure, so that I could plan for it without fear it would disappear. She never missed my small pop-up art shows. Even when only a handful of people came, she was there, dressed neatly, carrying that little canvas bag she liked. Sometimes she bought pieces I had marked as not for sale. She never told anyone, and I never called her out on it, but I knew she was quietly making sure I had enough money for supplies. She even slipped me extra brushes or paper, pretending she had, just found them at a discount. Her belief in me was steady, like a lighthouse that stayed lit no matter how rough the waters got at home. She never compared me to Sarah. She never asked why I was quiet or why I avoided certain family gatherings. She simply gave me a space to exist as myself. She would tell me, "The world will try to make you smaller. Don't help it do that." I clung to that sentence more than she probably knew. It became the foundation for the art studio I dreamed of, a small, focused space where my work could live without competing for attention against someone else's chaos. With Eleanor, I was never the practice daughter. I was simply Amanda, and in her eyes, that was more than enough. My father, Peter, had a way of making himself small in his own home. His favorite phrase to me was, "Don't start with your mother today," as though conflict was a weather pattern we could avoid if we just stayed indoors. It was not malice, it was absence dressed as peacekeeping. But absence can feel like betrayal when you need someone to step in. My mother, Margaret, was the opposite. Her presence filled every room, often to the point of suffocation. She liked to frame our personalities in a way that served her narrative. Amanda's practical, Sarah's our dreamer. At first, it sounded harmless, even flattering. Over time, I realized it was a neat way to box me into the role of the reliable one, the one who would not complain when Sarah's dreams cost money, attention, or time. Disagreement in our house was treated as disloyalty. If I voiced an opinion that clashed with hers, I was making things difficult. If I expressed emotion, it was manipulative, unless Sarah expressed it, in which case it was seen as honest and brave. The same rules did not apply to both of us, and everyone knew it. The unspoken order of operations in our house was clear. Sarah's wants came first, followed by my mother's version of reality, then a long, heavy silence from my father, and finally me, expected to adjust, absorb, and smooth things over. By the time it was my turn to speak, the conversation had moved on. I learned to negotiate with silence. Sometimes that meant quietly doing what I wanted without announcing it. Other times, it meant letting my mother believe she had won a point while I worked around her decision later. I kept mental maps of their moods, the way other people might keep emergency routes. I knew when to disappear into my room, when to keep my hands busy in the kitchen, and when to simply leave the house without saying where I was going. That dynamic, his retreat and her control, created a home where I was both invisible and overmanaged. My father's quiet suggested my problems were not worth speaking up about. My mother's voice insisted her version of events was the only truth. Somewhere between those extremes, I learned to keep my own counsel and trust my own read of reality. That skill, though born from neglect, would become one of my sharpest tools later in life. By the time I reached adulthood, my journals had become blueprints. They were filled with sketches of a small, light-filled studio, notes about the equipment I would need, and budget spreadsheets for a space I could almost afford. I tracked every expense, every potential income source, like I was preparing for a test no one else knew I was taking. Some pages were marked with red stars, my priority list, while others were full of ideas I might not touch for years. Art was my controlled rebellion. I worked in precise, technical styles that no one could easily belittle once the piece was finished. I avoided slapdash work, not because I feared criticism, but because perfection meant fewer openings for dismissal. Each painting, each sketch was proof that I existed beyond the family roles assigned to me. In those quiet hours, I did not need permission to create or a reason to justify my work. Self-control became more than a shield. It became my identity. I made a rule for myself: restraint first, reaction never. I would not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing me lose my temper. When I wanted to argue, I drew instead. When I wanted to cry, I organized my supplies or rewrote my budget plan. Restraint was not just silence, it was direction, the ability to channel every frustration into something I could keep, something that was mine. I collected small wins like other people collected keepsakes. I bookmarked grant opportunities, saved emails from potential landlords of vacant storefronts, and bought second-hand tools when I found them cheap. I kept a folder labeled Future with property listings and supplier contacts. Each step felt like laying a brick in something that might one day stand on its own. I also developed a quiet habit that no one knew about: keeping copies, timestamps, and witness lists for important interactions. It started as self-protection in a family where stories could be rewritten overnight. If there was a disagreement, I could point to the facts, though I rarely did. The evidence was more for me than for them, a private reassurance that I was not imagining things. This practice became second nature, so ingrained that I barely thought about it anymore. This internal world was my anchor. It was where I stored my plans, my proof, and my possibilities. In my family's eyes, I might always be the reliable, invisible one, but I knew that invisibility had its advantages. People rarely notice what they are not looking for, and that meant I could prepare without interference. One day, I promised myself, I would be ready when the moment came to step out of the background and into the center of the frame on my own terms. The day Alina passed was quiet, almost unnervingly so. Sarah made her grief public before the funeral arrangements were even set, black and white photos posted online with captions about the woman who taught me everything. She used the same two photos in every post. One of her holding Alina's hand in the hospital and another of them laughing in the garden. They were good pictures, but they told a curated story. I spent those first days doing what I always did, handling the logistics no one else wanted to think about. I wrote the obituary, coordinated the flowers, and called relatives who would have been forgotten otherwise. At the funeral, Mom kept steering guests toward Sarah. She was closest to Grandma, she said more than once, as if repeating it would make it true. I stood near the back, making sure the ushers had seating handled and the refreshments were ready for afterward. When people came up to me, it was usually to ask where something was or to compliment Sarah's heartfelt eulogy. No one asked me to speak, and I wasn't surprised. I grieved in the kitchen while everyone else gathered in the living room after the service. Away from the crowd, I found myself looking at the paintings Alina had kept, my paintings. She had hung them in places where she would see them every day. Beside the window where she read, above the table where she worked on puzzles. No one else seemed to notice them. In those quiet minutes, I traced the edges of the frames, wondering if she had done that too. There were small omissions that I clocked like entries in a ledger. The family slideshow played without a single picture of just me and Alina, even though I knew dozens existed. In the group shots that did make it in, I noticed how my image had been cropped tight, my connection to her minimized. It was a subtle rewriting, but I caught it all. Dad stayed mostly on the sidelines, offering a tired smile when our eyes met, but never stepping into the current of Mom's narrative. Sarah moved through the room like a star on opening night, accepting hugs, condolences, and long, lingering glances from people who seemed to have already decided she was the rightful inheritor of Alina's legacy. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't try to rewrite their version of the story. Instead, I filed it all away. The omissions, the choreography, the way even grief could be staged if it meant keeping me in the background. I knew, though I wouldn't admit it out loud yet, that this was not just a loss. It was the first act in something much larger. It started small, an offhand comment Sarah made at dinner about wanting to open a community cafe. She said it like a daydream, swirling her fork in her pasta while Mom beamed at her. Something warm and inviting, she said, where people can relax and feel at home. At first, I thought it was just another passing phase, like the year she was obsessed with pottery or the time she decided she was going to be a travel blogger. But within a week, I noticed changes. Sarah's social media filled with reposted cafe interiors, latte art, and mood boards. She tagged posts with phrases like future goals and manifesting. I started hearing more concrete details slip into conversation. She mentioned tasting pastries from a local baker, and a vendor commented on her post with, "Glad we're working together?" That was the first red flag. Sarah didn't have the money for this. She hadn't held a steady job in over a year. But Mom's vague reassurances started floating into my phone calls. "We'll make it work. You don't need to worry about money." I asked her directly once, during a grocery run, "How is Sarah paying for all this?" She gave me a sharp look over the cart and said, "Don't be petty at a time like this. She's honoring Grandma's memory." That was strange. Alina had never mentioned a cafe, and Sarah had never once talked about wanting to run a business before. The clues kept stacking. Vendors were talking to her like she was a confirmed client. A local roaster posted a story about big things coming with Sarah Simmons. And yet, no one in the family had announced anything official. It was all whispers, hashtags, and photo ops. I started taking screenshots, dates, comments, anything that linked her claims to a timeline. I kept a folder on my computer labeled simply Cafe. I didn't know yet what I would do with it, but I knew better than to trust the story I was being told at face value. By the end of the month, Sarah had posted a picture of herself holding a cappuccino in a cafe that wasn't hers, captioned, "One day soon." The comments were full of congratulations and heart emojis. To everyone else, it looked like she was building something. To me, it looked like she was already spending money she didn't have, and I had a growing suspicion about where it might come from. The call from Thomas Blake's office came on a Tuesday morning. The will reading would be in 2 weeks, and attendance was confirmed via a group text from Mom. Sarah responded with a string of heart emojis and a coffee cup, which felt like a private joke I wasn't in on. A few cousins chimed in with, "Can't wait to see everyone," as though this was a reunion and not a legal proceeding. I set aside the sealed letter Alina had left me, a plain envelope with my name in her looping handwriting. She'd given it to me months before she passed, saying only, "Read this when it's time." I didn't know what it contained, but I had a feeling it was connected to the studio fund she'd always talked about. I placed it in the same folder as my notebook, where I had started jotting questions about probate terms, what could be contested, and how distributions were handled. Relatives started calling each other in the days leading up to the reading. There was a lot of speculation about what Alina had left behind, her small cottage, some savings, maybe even a few heirlooms. Sarah mentioned to an aunt that she had big plans, but wouldn't say what. She wore that designer apron she'd been flaunting online to a casual brunch, telling anyone who asked that she was just practicing. No one questioned what for. Mom, ever the host, insisted on a post-reading luncheon at a crowded restaurant downtown. To celebrate family, she said, as if it were a neutral gesture. I knew better. A packed room meant an audience, and in my family, an audience always meant someone was about to be put in their place. I started mentally cataloging who would be there and where they might be seated. Dad kept quiet, as usual, though I caught him watching me once or twice like he was debating whether to say something. His eyes lingered for a second longer than usual, but in the end, he stayed silent. That was the rhythm of our family, Mom directing the show, Dad lingering in the wings, me filling in the gaps without recognition. By the morning of the will reading, I had my letter, my notebook, and a pen ready. I wasn't sure what I was walking into, but I could feel the shape of something being arranged around me. Not a coincidence. A set piece. The kind of thing that looks spontaneous to everyone else, but is, in truth, planned to the last detail. In the days before the will reading, the tone in the family shifted. Mom was in what I called her indulgent mode, overly sweet, but with an undercurrent that told me I was already on thin ice. She'd tilt her head when talking to me, like she was humoring a difficult child. Sarah, on the other hand, seemed to be performing for an invisible audience. Every interaction was louder, more exaggerated, more curated, as though she was rehearsing for a spotlight moment. Dad stayed to the edges, as usual. I noticed him hovering in doorways, catching my eye, then glancing away like he didn't want to be caught paying attention. That was his style, present but detached, especially when Mom was in a certain mood. I sometimes wondered if he thought that staying silent meant staying neutral, but silence always takes a side. I tested the waters once, asking Sarah if she had chosen an outfit for the will reading. She smiled without looking up from her phone. Of course, she said. It's going to be a big day. The way she said it made it sound less like a legal formality and more like a personal coronation. She even winked at me, like we were in on the same secret, when I knew perfectly well I was on the outside of whatever was coming. Small boundary tests started to appear. One afternoon, Sarah borrowed my tablet to work on what she called menu design ideas. She didn't ask, she just took it from my desk. When I pointed out that I needed it back, she laughed and said, "Relax, I'm just making something pretty." Mom overheard and told me not to be so territorial. "You've always been practical," she said. "Let Sarah have her creative space." Even minor collaborations became lopsided. I offered to help organize a charity event Mom was overseeing, and Sarah volunteered to design the invitations. The final product was full of spelling errors, so I fixed them quietly before they went out. Instead of thanking me, Mom told people that Sarah had done it all herself while I handled the boring stuff. That phrase, boring stuff, stuck in my mind like a splinter. It was clear I was being positioned as the difficult one, the joyless one, the one who would inevitably cause a scene. The more I tried to stay neutral, the more they filled in the silence with their own narrative. By the night before the will reading, I had the distinct sense that a performance was about to take place, and I was cast in the role of the loser before I'd even stepped on stage. The morning of the will reading, the seating was already arranged when I arrived. My place card was set so I would be facing the room, not the attorney, which meant everyone could watch my reactions. Sarah's spot, of course, was next to Mom, angled for easy photographs. Dad was at the far end, a position that kept him safely out of the line of fire. A few chairs had been shifted just enough to make the room feel unbalanced, as if the focal point had been moved slightly toward Sarah. It was too deliberate to be accidental. Even the small details felt staged. The water glasses were filled before I arrived, but mine was conspicuously empty. When I reached for a pitcher, an aunt intercepted it with a bright, "Let me do that," as though she were being helpful. All I could think was that it would be easier to study me if my hands were still. Before the meeting started, Mom made light jokes to the relatives gathered in the hallway. "Amanda's very practical about money," she said, her voice carrying just enough to reach me. "She'll be fine with whatever happens today." Sarah giggled, checking her reflection in her phone camera like she was about to go on stage. Someone commented on how radiant she looked, and she gave a bashful smile that I knew was rehearsed. I caught Sarah rehearsing little lines under her breath, phrases about gratitude, hard work, and following Grandma's dreams. It wasn't subtle. She tilted her chin, smiled in different ways, and even tested how her voice would sound in a laugh. I realized she wasn't preparing for a legal reading at all. She was preparing for a performance. The will reading was her stage, and she was ready to play the lead. I had no plan to make a scene, no intention of arguing in the moment. My goal was simpler: observe and remember. I scanned the room, noting who was present and where they were positioned. I took mental snapshots of every smirk, every phone set to record. The audience was already in place, waiting for whatever drama they thought they were about to witness. By the time Thomas Blake walked in with the folder, the atmosphere was as carefully arranged as a stage set. All I had to do was sit down, keep my face neutral, and let them think they were running the show. They had no idea that I was already confirming my witness list, noting timestamps, and running through an exit strategy I might not need for months, but would be ready for all the same. The conference room smelled faintly of paper and lemon cleaner, the kind of neutral scent meant to put people at ease. It didn't work. Everyone had taken their seats, and the hum of side conversations felt rehearsed, like a warm-up act before the main show. Phones were out, not to check the time, but to be ready for whatever moments people thought worth capturing. A few relatives leaned back in their chairs, already smirking, as if they knew there would be entertainment. Thomas Blake, the family attorney, entered with the kind of steady pace that told me he'd done this hundreds of times. He set a leather folder on the table, adjusting his glasses before looking around the room. "Thank you all for being here," he said, voice calm but carrying. His tone was the only neutral thing in the space. I sat 2 seats down from Sarah, close enough to hear her shallow, excited breaths, but far enough that she couldn't whisper in my ear. She was wearing that same designer apron from her social media posts, tied neatly over a pale blouse. It looked ridiculous in the setting, but she didn't care. She wanted it in the pictures. The apron's crisp ties and embroidered logo were as much a costume as an accessory. Thomas began with a few standard statements about Alina's life, her assets, and her intentions to provide for her family. I felt my chest tighten when he said my name, reading aloud the portion that detailed the studio fund. It wasn't much in the scope of inheritances, but to me, it was everything. Hearing it spoken made my throat ache. It felt like Alina was speaking through him, telling me she hadn't forgotten me. I barely had time to take in the words before Mom interrupted. She leaned forward, smiling at the room like she was about to share good news. "I think it's important we clarify the family's intent here," she said, cutting clean through Thomas's sentence. Her tone was sugary, but her eyes were fixed on me. Sarah tilted her phone, the camera angled to catch her own face as she listened. I caught a glimpse of the recording screen, red dot blinking, timer running. Someone 2 seats over muttered, "Finally," under their breath, as though they'd been waiting for this. The energy in the room shifted from solemn to staged. The reading of the will had stopped being a legal matter. It had become the opening scene of something else entirely. And I understood, in that moment, that whatever was about to happen wasn't spontaneous. It was planned, timed, and choreographed down to the last smirk. Mom didn't waste a second once she had the floor. She leaned back in her chair like she was settling into a familiar role. "Amanda was just the practice daughter," she said, with a light laugh, as if it were a harmless joke. The words hung in the air, too sharp to be softened by her tone. She looked around, gauging reactions, and was rewarded with a few nervous chuckles from relatives who didn't want to seem uptight. Even the ones who stayed silent avoided my eyes. Before I could even process the sting, Sarah jumped in. "Must suck to be second best," she added, smiling directly at me before glancing back at her phone screen to make sure she'd caught her own delivery. Her voice had that edge of satisfaction, the one that says she's been saving the line for exactly this moment. She tilted her phone slightly toward Mom, angling for the reaction shot. Thomas Blake shifted in his seat, clearing his throat like he might speak up, but Mom pressed on. "It's what Grandma would have wanted," she said, in the same tone someone might use to smooth over an awkward dinner topic. She slid the check across the table, my inheritance, right into Sarah's waiting hands. I saw the numbers clearly. It was exactly the amount Alina had set aside for me, right down to the cent. Sarah folded it neatly, tucking it into her designer apron pocket like it was a prop she had been given on stage. "This is going to make the cafe a dream come true," she announced, looking to the room instead of me. Her words landed like the final line of a scene she'd rehearsed. Thomas opened his mouth again, but Mom cut him off with a raised hand. "No need to get into all that legal talk," she said. "We're keeping it in the family." She said family like it was a shield, as if disagreeing with her now would be a betrayal of blood. Around the table, I saw small nods, tiny affirmations that they were aligned with her version of events. From somewhere near the door, a phone camera clicked. Someone was capturing this moment, though I doubted they understood how perfectly they were documenting my humiliation. The air in the room felt heavier, like we'd all agreed this was settled, even if the will itself hadn't been read in full. I kept my hands folded in my lap, my face calm. Inside, every syllable was burning itself into memory. Practice, daughter. Second best. What Grandma would have wanted. They weren't just words, they were evidence. And I was already filing them away in the place where I kept everything I'd one day use. The room reacted in small, fractured ways, just enough to register, not enough for anyone to claim they had said anything wrong. A few relatives laughed lightly, the kind of laugh you give when you're not sure if something is a joke, but you do not want to be the only one not smiling. Others stayed very still, eyes locked on the table, pretending to be focused on the grain of the wood rather than what had just been said. One aunt glanced at me, then away, as if even brief eye contact might drag her into the middle of it. A cousin shifted uncomfortably in his seat, tapping his pen against the table in a steady rhythm. No one said my name. No one asked me if I was okay. Dad kept his gaze on his hands, fingers laced together, thumbs moving like he was silently counting seconds. He did not look up once during the exchange. I knew that was his way of coping, staying quiet, staying still, but in moments like this, silence felt like agreement. The restaurant staff, who had been quietly setting coffee cups on the side counter, froze mid-motion. One server's eyes widened slightly before she caught herself and went back to arranging creamers. Even strangers could tell this was not just a family matter, it was a spectacle. Sarah leaned over to hug Mom, the check still in her hand. Cameras and phones went up around the table. A cousin 2 seats over raised her phone higher for a better angle. I could see the caption forming in her mind before she even typed it. A perfect, polished moment of family unity. The clicks of phone cameras and the low murmur of conversation filled the space where any defense of me might have gone. People will say later that they did not know what to do, that they stayed quiet to avoid making things worse. But I have learned that inaction is just a quieter form of consent. I kept scanning faces. The ones who smiled too long. The ones who looked away too quickly. Every reaction was a note in my mental ledger. The audience was not neutral. They had chosen their positions, even if they thought they were invisible in the crowd. In that moment, I realized the humiliation was not just in the words Mom and Sarah had spoken. It was in the way everyone else stayed seated, watching, letting it happen. They thought the scene was over. I knew it was only the first act. I inhaled once, letting the air move slowly in and out, measuring my voice before I even thought of speaking. But I didn't speak. I stayed silent, my hands resting in my lap, my expression as steady as if nothing had happened. It wasn't numbness, it was control. Words thrown in anger would be wasted here. They would only become another piece of footage for someone else's highlight reel. Inside, the humiliation curled tight, compressing into something solid and sharp. I replayed the exact phrasing: practice daughter, second best, what grandma would have wanted. Each phrase fixed itself in my memory with a timestamp, a witness list, and the tone in which it was delivered. I didn't just hear them. I recorded them in the way someone stores evidence. The ache of betrayal was there, but it wasn't a wildfire. It was a slow, deliberate burn, feeding a clarity I had never felt before. I realized there was no winning this scene, not today. You cannot argue with a performance and expect the crowd to turn on the star. The only way to beat it is to produce something better, something they can't ignore or rewrite. The conversations around me blurred into background noise. Coffee cups clinked. A server poured water into Sarah's glass with a careful hand. A cousin leaned in to whisper to an aunt, their eyes flicking toward me and then away. Someone at the far end of the table chuckled softly at something on their phone, oblivious, or pretending to be, to the tension in the air. Every small gesture became part of the catalog I was building. I felt the room press in, expecting some reaction from me, a protest, a tear, even a laugh to show I could take a joke. I gave them nothing. No reaction, no relief. Just a blank surface they could project their own assumptions onto. That restraint wasn't easy. It cost me the ache in my jaw from holding it shut, the stiffness in my shoulders from refusing to shift in my seat. A new objective formed in the quiet space between heartbeats. I would not try to fix their version of me. I would build my own. And when I walked out of here, I would carry this scene intact, unedited, until the day I decided to use it. That day wouldn't be far away. I didn't know the exact shape of the plan yet, but I knew one thing for certain. When it came, it would not be in private. It would be in front of every single person who had just watched me sit here in silence, and they would remember which side they chose. The first thing I did after that day was go quiet. Not the sulking kind of quiet that makes people ask what's wrong, but the kind of quiet that disappears from family conversations, group chats, and casual run-ins at the grocery store. Silence gave me room to listen, and listening gave me everything I needed. Every morning before work, I made coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and opened my laptop to public records. I learned how to navigate the county's property tax rolls, searching not just for my sister's cafe address, but for every commercial property within 3 blocks. It was all public information: purchase prices, tax payment history, liens. And buried in the details, I found a name: Martin Fields, the building owner. He wasn't a landlord in the traditional sense. He was a man who had inherited the property from an uncle, and he'd been barely keeping up with it ever since. His payment history showed late fees. The most recent bill had a red delinquent flag. Next came the state's business entity search. Sarah's Cafe existed only as an LLC filing, a barebones document listing her as the sole member. But the lease, I would later learn, had a cosigner: Mom. That meant 2 things. Sarah didn't have the credit to secure it herself, and Mom was legally tied to the property's performance. A detail like that wasn't just useful, it was leverage. I started tracking every scrap of information that could matter later. Vendor relationships, equipment purchases, permits filed with the city. Sarah had tagged a coffee roaster on social media, so I found their website, checked their wholesale policies, and noted the deposit requirements. I did the same for the bakery she'd claimed would be supplying pastries, the florist for her planned Instagram wall, and the construction company handling renovations. Every one of them had terms, timelines, and costs, things that could be disrupted by delays, unexpected expenses, or sudden compliance checks. I built a digital dossier, folder by folder: property documents, business filings, screenshots of Sarah's posts, PDFs of city ordinances on occupancy and signage, even photos of the building's exterior from the last 3 years, just in case someone tried to claim an alteration, was always there. I downloaded the county's inspection reports, highlighted repeat citations, and filed them under future opportunities. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. In family conversations, if anyone brought up the cafe, I let them talk. I nodded, smiled faintly, and stored away every date and detail they offered. My goal wasn't to confront them, it was to be ready for the moment when all of this would matter. By the end of the first month, I knew more about Sarah's business than she did. I knew her lease term down to the month, the renewal window, and the exact penalty for an insurance lapse. I knew which repairs were the landlord's responsibility and which were hers. I knew how much money was flowing out before she even opened her doors. Most importantly, I knew Martin Fields was vulnerable. And in real estate, vulnerability isn't just a weakness, it's an open door. Information alone doesn't win a war, you need resources to act on it. That meant tightening every screw in my own finances until I could afford not just to survive, but to strike. The first move was cutting my expenses. I canceled every subscription that wasn't essential, sold a few art pieces I had kept for myself, and stopped eating out entirely. My nights shifted from dinners with friends to evenings in my studio apartment, working under the yellow light of the desk lamp. I took commissioned portrait work, family pets, children, even one elaborate wedding gift, and pocketed every payment into a separate account labeled Project. On weekends, I picked up shifts at a local gallery. It wasn't glamorous work, hanging other people's art, sweeping floors after events, but the pay was steady, and the owner didn't ask questions about why I wanted cash instead of direct deposit. I also dusted off my old camera and offered headshot sessions to small business owners. The work piled up, and so did the money. I liquidated non-essentials. A few vintage jackets from college, an unused tablet still in its box, even a stack of rare books that had been sitting on my shelf for years. Every sale went into the project account. Watching that balance grow was like watching a seed push through the dirt. The more it grew, the calmer I felt, not because I was rich, but because I was no longer cornered. When the account reached a certain point, I took a calculated risk. I applied for a small line of credit. My income history was steady enough, and I kept my credit score clean, so approval came quickly. The limit wasn't huge, but combined with my savings, it was enough to cover an acquisition if the right opportunity came up. I treated the available balance like it didn't exist unless a precise door opened. I wasn't doing this alone. I quietly reached out to Priya Narang, an acquaintance from an arts grant committee. She had capital, business sense, and a taste for quiet, clean investments. Over coffee, I laid out a vague proposal, a small property purchase, low risk, with a clear exit clause. I didn't mention Sarah, Mom, or the cafe. Priya didn't ask. Within a week, we had a signed agreement that kept her role silent and my control absolute. Every move was designed to keep me stable while preparing for the strike. I made sure my day job performance stayed solid so no one suspected I was distracted. I kept my rent payments early, my bills auto-paid, my public profile boring. No vacations, no splurges, no visible changes that would make anyone wonder where my money was going. I wasn't just saving for the opportunity, I was making myself unshakable when it came. By the time I was ready, I had 3 separate cushions: my savings, the line of credit, and Priya's silent investment. Enough to buy if the building came on the market, enough to cover closing costs, and enough to handle immediate repairs without hesitation. Money doesn't erase betrayal, but it does buy the means to make sure it never happens again on someone else's terms. And that, for me, was worth every quiet sacrifice. Money and documents could get me close to the goal, but soft information, rumors, habits, offhand remarks, was the glue that held it together. And the only way to get that was to blend in until I was invisible. I became a regular at the shops within 2 blocks of Sarah's cafe. Not the flashy kind of regular who asks for the usual, but the quiet kind who tips well, smiles, and never makes anyone feel rushed. The bookstore owner, who had been in the neighborhood for 20 years, liked to talk about the old days and who came and went. The boutique owner across the street always had an opinion about new businesses. I listened, I nodded, and I let people fill silences without realizing they were telling me exactly what I needed. I learned that the florist Sarah wanted for her Instagram wall had a backlog of events booked through summer. That meant if Sarah missed her installation date, she'd have to wait months or pay extra for a rush job. I didn't have to cause the delay. Just knowing the bottleneck existed was enough to file away for later. The coffee roaster Sarah had tagged on social media was based in the next town over. I called under the pretense of asking about wholesale pricing for a friend starting a coffee shop. The rep, Jonah, was chatty. He mentioned Sarah had been a little behind on sending in her signed contract and deposit. I filed that away. Delays cost leverage. At a nearby bakery, I struck up a conversation with Eli, a part-time barista applying for a job at Sarah's place. He told me they'd been holding group interviews in the cafe space even though it was still under renovation. That meant occupancy codes might be relevant sooner than Sarah expected, and sooner than she might be ready for. I volunteered at a local arts event where I knew Sarah wanted coverage for her grand opening. There, I met Sophie Carter, a journalist for the local paper. We talked about neighborhood changes, business openings, and the kinds of stories she liked to cover. I made a note to keep her in mind for later, not to gossip to, but to make sure the right eyes were present when the time came. Every scrap of information had a place in my growing map. Sarah's PR contacts, the estimated delivery dates for her espresso machines, the fact that the construction crew had been slowed by an unexpected wiring issue. Even the schedule of the building inspector, which I learned from a casual chat with a hardware store clerk, went into the file. My online presence stayed neutral. No likes on her posts, no cryptic quotes, no passive-aggressive commentary. If anyone checked my profiles, they'd see nothing but art, work, and the occasional picture of my cat. I wanted no trace of myself connected to Sarah's world until I chose to appear. Soft data isn't about catching someone in a lie, it's about seeing the gap between the story they tell and the facts on the ground. Sarah's gaps were widening. I just had to wait for them to crack open. Once the paper trail and the soft data lined up, it was time to act. I knew Martin Fields was the key. If I could get the building, everything else would fall into place. I approached Martin privately, not through an agent or public listing. We met at a small diner just outside town, where no one from the neighborhood would see us together. I ordered coffee, let him talk about the property, and listened for signs of strain. They came quickly mentions of balloon payment, tax arrears, and maintenance headaches. His hands fidgeted with the sugar packets as he talked about how his uncle had left him the building and how he'd never wanted to be a landlord in the first place. I offered him certainty over price. No drawn-out negotiations, no inspection delays that would drag this into public view. I told him I could close in weeks, not months, and that I would handle all legal costs. He didn't hide his relief. It was the kind of relief you see when someone's been carrying a weight they never wanted and you've just offered to take it off their back. From there, I brought in a real estate attorney I trusted. Her job wasn't just to make the sale happen. It was to build leverage into the purchase. We negotiated for assignment of the existing lease, meaning I would step directly into Martin's position as landlord the moment the deal closed. We included a right of reentry clause for specific defaults, missed insurance payments, unapproved alterations, code violations. I asked her to make sure those clauses were written in plain, enforceable language. No wiggle room. The personal guarantee clause stayed, with Mom's name still attached. That meant any major breach by Sarah could trigger direct financial consequences for her. I didn't need to weaponize it immediately. Just knowing it existed was enough for now. My attorney raised an eyebrow when she saw that name, but she didn't ask questions. I confirmed cure periods and inspection rights, ensuring I could address violations quickly if they occurred. I made sure the lease terms gave me the option to shift from long-term to month-to-month at market rates once the initial term expired. Every clause was a tool, every tool a potential move. I had my attorney explain each one twice, once for legality and once for strategy. We moved fast. Within 3 weeks, the sale closed. The deed recorded in my name. Utilities and insurance queued for transfer. I set up a separate business account for the property, keeping it distinct from my personal finances. I even registered a neutral-sounding holding company so my name wouldn't appear in everyday dealings. By the time Sarah's cafe was nearing completion, she had no idea that the woman who walked past the front window some mornings, coffee in hand, expression unreadable, was now her landlord on paper. I kept my pace slow when passing, just enough for her to maybe notice me, but not enough to be certain. The most dangerous moves are the ones no one sees coming, and mine was already in place. Owning the building was the foundation. Now I needed the framework for the reveal. A structure of rules, deadlines, and conditions that would look entirely routine to an outsider, but would close like a steel trap when the moment came. First, I had my attorney pre-draft notices of default for predictable issues, lapsed insurance coverage, unapproved alterations to the space, exceeding occupancy limits. Each notice was written in neutral, procedural language. No threats, no emotion. Just the kind of formal communication that carried weight because it was rooted in the lease. The dates were left blank so they could be filled in the moment an infraction occurred. I set calendar alerts for all critical deadlines, proof of insurance submission, quarterly maintenance inspections, and renewal options. I built them into 2 separate systems, my phone and a wall calendar in my apartment, because I wasn't going to rely on memory. Where possible, I aligned these dates with moments Sarah would want maximum positive attention, press events, influencer visits, seasonal promotions. The goal wasn't to disrupt her cafe randomly. It was to make any disruption visible, at the exact moment it would sting most. Next, I scheduled a compliance walkthrough with the city's building inspector for the week of her grand opening. Nothing unusual, just the kind of occupancy and safety check every business is subject to. But I knew from my soft data that her renovations had been rushed, and signage was one of the last things on her list. If she passed, fine. If she didn't, the consequences were hers to manage in public, and there would be no one to blame but herself. I also arranged a clean, reasonable alternative in case she chose to negotiate instead of fight. Convert the lease to a month-to-month agreement at current market rates, with a requirement to cure all outstanding issues. On paper, it was fair. In reality, it was leverage. If she refused, the default process would continue. If she accepted, the rent hike alone would drain her launch budget within months. To control the narrative, I prepared a press packet. It contained no personal commentary, only neutral facts. Date of purchase, lease terms, and the relevant clauses. I included copies of publicly filed documents so anyone could verify them. The packet was for Sophie Carter, under embargo until I gave the word. I even printed 2 versions, one with extra photos of the building, one stripped down to the essentials. The first was for a slow news day, the second for when speed mattered more than depth. Finally, I rehearsed the reveal. Where I would stand so the cameras would catch Sarah's face. How I would place the file on the counter so the embossed seal on the deed caught the light. The exact tone of my voice when I said, "I'm your new landlord." Every detail mattered. I practiced it in front of a mirror until my expression was perfectly neutral, no trace of gloating, just authority. The trap wasn't about catching Sarah doing something wrong. It was about letting her walk straight into the consequences of her own choices, with an audience ready to watch it happen. And when the moment came, every piece of it would look inevitable. With the trap set, the hardest part was doing nothing. Waiting without flinching required as much discipline as building the plan in the first place. The temptation to rush in, to take the win early, was strong, but I knew that a premature move would weaken the impact. I didn't want just a private victory. I wanted a reversal that everyone could see. I cut off all unnecessary family contact. No holiday dinners, no phone calls, no just checking in messages. If they wanted me, they could go through my attorney. That kept me from being baited into an argument that might give something away. Mom tried twice to leave voicemails under the guise of family updates. I didn't return them. I saved them instead in case I needed proof of tone later. In public, I kept my routine steady. Work, errands, art. No sudden changes, no vanishing acts. If I looked too busy or too quiet, someone might start wondering why. Consistency was camouflage. At my local grocery store, I still made small talk with the clerk about the weather. At the library, I returned books exactly on time, even if I hadn't read them. I practiced the reveal line until it was muscle memory. I'm your new landlord. Not a question, not a boast, just a fact. I said it while making coffee, folding laundry, or walking to the bus. I practiced saying it after stubbing my toe or spilling tea, so I'd know it could come out steady even if my heart rate spiked. The file stayed packed and ready by my front door, inside a plain, leather portfolio. Deed copy, lease excerpts, stamped notices, and my attorney's contact card. Next to it, a slim digital recorder with fresh batteries, just in case someone tried to twist the narrative on the spot. I tested the recorder once a week to make sure it worked. I rehearsed contingencies. What if Sarah denied it outright? What if Mom tried to grab the file? What if the press swarmed me with questions? Each scenario had a script and an exit strategy. In some, I left quietly after delivering the notice. In others, I stayed long enough to let the cameras record the shift in the room. I even had a plan in case the inspector didn't show, an alternate moment involving the press packet. I confirmed the witness list without making it look like a list. I knew which relatives would attend the opening, which local reporters would be there, and which city officials tended to drop by new businesses. I had notes on their arrival patterns from previous events. It wasn't luck, it was alignment. When the temptation to rush things hit me, I went back to my notes. Every timestamp, every quote, every witness. Evidence wasn't just proof, it was patience you could hold in your hands. I reminded myself that my silence wasn't absence. It was pressure. By the week before opening, I could feel the moment coming. It was like standing at the edge of a diving board, toes curling over the surface, knowing the drop was inevitable. And when it came, I'd be ready to step into it without a single extra heartbeat. Opening day was theater, and Sarah had cast herself as the star. The street outside the cafe was strung with pastel balloons, a rented arch framing the double doors. A bright red ribbon stretched across the entrance, already pulling slightly in the wind. The smell of espresso drifted out in warm bursts every time someone went in or out. Fresh pastries lined the display inside, their glaze catching the light from oversized pendant lamps. Influencers and their ring lights clustered near the front windows, snapping photos of the latte art printed on sample cups. Sophie Carter stood to one side with a small camera crew, her notepad tucked under her arm, already scribbling observations between shots. Local politicians shook hands with anyone holding a coffee, slipping in front of cameras whenever possible. A local guitarist played soft background music near the far wall, just loud enough to keep the hum of conversation from dipping into awkward pauses. I arrived in neutral clothes: black jeans, gray sweater, plain leather boots. Nothing that would pull focus until I chose to take it. I carried a to-go cup from another cafe, partly to look like any other guest, partly because I wanted my first sip of the day unconnected to Sarah's business. I stayed near the back, scanning the crowd until I spotted the building inspector I'd invited for a routine check. He nodded once, more to himself than to me, and disappeared inside with a practiced efficiency. The file was in my left hand. Inside, deed copy, lease excerpts, stamped notices. Each document was placed so I could slide them out in sequence. The weight was comforting, like a tool I'd carried for years. I'd tested the folder hinge the night before, making sure it would open smoothly without fumbling. I positioned myself so Sarah could see me without quite placing me. Her eyes skimmed over me twice during her pre-ribbon mingling, but she was too busy laughing with guests to hold the thought. Margaret hovered near the mayor, smiling just a little too widely, her hand occasionally resting on Sarah's shoulder as if she were presenting a prize. I waited. The inspector finished his first circuit and stood by the espresso bar, flipping through a clipboard. Sophie adjusted her camera strap and moved closer to the podium set up for speeches. Sarah stepped up in her designer apron, microphone in hand, thanking everyone who believed in the dream. She had a glow about her, the kind that comes from being certain of your audience. The moment I was waiting for was coming. I felt my pulse steady instead of race. When she reached her practiced, "Follow your dreams" line, I would move. That was the cue, the one I'd been rehearsing for months. Everything in the scene, the cameras, the crowd, the inspection, was in place. All I had to do was take the step. Sarah's voice swelled as she leaned into the microphone. And most importantly, follow your dreams, because nothing is impossible if you work hard and believe. That was my cue. I stepped forward through the crowd, the scrape of my boots against the polished floor drawing a few glances. The warmth of the espresso machines seemed to fade as conversations thinned into a hush. I walked at the same unhurried pace I had practiced, letting the space open around me. By the time I reached the counter, there was a small semicircle of distance between me and the nearest guests. I set the leather portfolio down on the polished wood with a muted thud, the sound landing heavier than its weight. I let my hand rest on the cover for a beat before looking directly at Sarah. "I'm your new landlord." My voice was even, carrying just enough to reach the far corners of the cafe without strain. It wasn't a threat or an announcement, it was a statement of fact. Sarah froze, still holding the microphone, the smile she'd been wearing starting to flicker at the edges. Margaret's head turned toward me sharply, her wide grin tightening into something brittle. A couple of phones that had been filming Sarah now tilted toward me instead. I saw one influencer's eyebrows shoot upward before she reflexively hit record again. I unlatched the portfolio and slid the first document forward. A certified copy of the deed with my name printed in bold. The crisp paper caught a beam of light from the front window, the embossed seal visible even from a few steps away. I placed it where Sarah could see it clearly, then turned it so Margaret could read without taking a step. "This is the building's recorded title," I said, my tone steady. "And this," I pulled the second document, the lease excerpt, "is the clause about proof of insurance, unapproved alterations, and occupancy limits. These are the terms you agreed to." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The words carried because no one else in the room was talking anymore. Even the guitarist in the corner had stopped mid-song, the final note hanging awkwardly in the air. Somewhere behind me, Sophie Carter's camera clicked in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Finally, I slid a single-page notice forward, printed in crisp black ink. "Here's the option to cure those issues within the stated deadline, pay market rent, or vacate per the lease. My attorney's contact information is on the bottom." I capped the pen I'd brought and placed it beside the notice, not pushing it toward her, just setting it there. Sarah's eyes darted to Margaret, then back to me. Margaret's mouth opened, but no words came out. I waited, hands resting lightly on the edge of the counter, my posture open but unyielding. The silence that followed felt like a held breath, every pair of eyes in the room tracking the shift in power. This was her stage, I just changed the script. Sarah's fingers tightened around the microphone until her knuckles whitened. This isn't real. Mom said this was ours." Her voice pitched upward, the first crack in her polished presentation. The way she said "ours" told me she still didn't understand where her rights ended and mine began. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I turned the deed so the crowd could read it for themselves. The embossed seal caught the light, and I could see at least 3 people leaning forward to read the bold name printed across the top. "Recorded with the county clerk's office 3 weeks ago," I said. "You can verify it online." My tone was calm, almost instructional. Margaret stepped forward, her hand curling protectively around Sarah's arm as if she could shield her from ink on paper. "We'll call our lawyer," she announced, her tone sharp, eyes scanning the crowd for someone to nod in solidarity. I kept my gaze steady on her, unmoved. "Please do," I replied, tapping the bottom of the notice. "The number's right here. He'll be expecting your call." The building inspector, right on cue, stepped up to the counter. "While we're here," he said, "I'll need to review the occupancy numbers and fire clearance signage." His tone was neutral, professional, but it shifted the air in the room like a sudden draft. Sarah's eyes widened, Margaret's lips pressed together hard enough to blanch. I stepped back, giving the inspector room to move past me. He counted chairs methodically, his pen clicking twice before he glanced at the capacity sign and made a small note on his clipboard. "This doesn't match your stated capacity," he said mildly, "but we'll follow up in writing." A ripple moved through the crowd, guests glancing at each other, whispering just loud enough to be heard in fragments. "That's not good," someone muttered. Phones tilted, capturing not just faces, but the documents still resting on the counter. Sophie Carter stood a few feet away, her camera lens locked on Margaret's expression, snapping frame after frame with a patience that told me she'd been waiting for this. Sarah set the microphone down slowly, as if it had grown heavier in her hands. Margaret kept her posture tall, but her fingers twitched against her sides, betraying the strain in her composure. Neither of them moved to touch the papers. Neither wanted to be the one to pick them up in front of an audience. I didn't need to speak again. The room was doing the work for me, eyes shifting, loyalties rebalancing, the sound of small alliances cracking. Even the mayor had taken a step back, his smile replaced with a polite, neutral mask. This wasn't their victory photo anymore. I let the silence stretch just long enough for discomfort to bloom, then glanced once at Sophie's camera before turning toward the door. The inspector was already jotting his final note. Behind me, the soft sound of the crowd's murmuring swelled, filling the space where Sarah's carefully rehearsed speech had ended, leaving nothing but the weight of reality in its place. The murmur of voices followed me like a tide as I stepped back toward the center of the room. I paused just long enough for the crowd to register that I wasn't leaving yet. The faint hiss of the espresso machine filled the silence, the milk steamer sputtering once before cutting off entirely. Even the background guitarist had stopped pretending to tune his strings. "I'll make this simple," I said, projecting my voice without raising it. "You have 3 options. Cure the listed issues by the deadline with documentation, pay market rent moving forward, or vacate per the lease terms." My eyes swept the room, not lingering on Sarah or Margaret alone, but on every person who had just witnessed the shift. It wasn't just a message to them, it was a record for anyone listening. I closed the portfolio and set it neatly on the counter beside the untouched documents. The stack sat there like an unclaimed weapon. "Keys to the building stay with me," I added, tapping the key ring in my pocket. The soft jingle was almost lost under the sound of someone whispering, "Wow. Anything else you can handle through my attorney." A few guests exchanged glances. One older man near the door gave me a small, approving nod. It wasn't support I needed, but it told me the message was landing. The mayor's wife crossed her arms and looked toward the exit, already distancing herself from the scene. I turned to the crowd. "Thank you for coming to celebrate your neighbor's new venture. Please enjoy the complimentary drinks provided by the roaster." I gestured toward a stack of fresh cups on a side table. They were kind enough to donate them this morning. I had arranged that detail days ago, knowing generosity would contrast sharply against Sarah's sudden scramble. Several guests moved toward the table, grateful for something to do other than stand frozen. Sarah's hands had moved to her hips, her chin jutting forward, but she still didn't pick up the papers. Margaret's jaw tightened. Her gaze had narrowed into a calculated assessment. They were still in performance mode, but their audience had shifted from admiration to appraisal. I walked toward the door without hurry, letting each step be measured and deliberate. Phones tracked me. Sophie Carter kept her lens steady, following my every move, her expression unreadable but focused. The inspector gave me a slight nod as I passed, already tucking his clipboard under his arm. Outside, the cold air felt cleaner than it had in months. I didn't look back through the glass, though I could see the reflection of people still standing in small clusters, talking in low voices. Let them decide how to play the rest of their day. I'd already written the ending. The weight in my pocket wasn't just keys, it was control. And as the door closed behind me, I knew there was nothing they could say in that room that would change what everyone had just seen. Within a week, Sarah's carefully curated launch began to unravel. The first blow came from her insurance provider, who sent a formal notice that her policy would lapse unless she addressed the occupancy and structural compliance issues flagged by the inspector. The cure costs alone would have eaten a third of her launch budget, and those estimates didn't even include the permits she had overlooked. Then came the lease terms. My attorney sent a reminder of the market rent clause and the due date for the first adjusted payment. She stalled for a few days, claiming her investors would wire the difference, but the money never arrived on time. Each day past the deadline added late fees, shrinking her already strained reserves. I imagined the spreadsheet she must have stared at late at night, the numbers refusing to bend to her will. Vendors who had been willing to extend generous credit before opening day now tightened their terms. The coffee roaster, embarrassed by the public scene, demanded payment up front. The bakery that supplied her pastries canceled their agreement after a bounced check. Even the florist, whose bouquets had filled her window displays, stopped deliveries until outstanding invoices were cleared. The novelty of her cafe quickly dulled for suppliers who realized she was no longer a guaranteed good bet. On social media, sympathy was split. Her loyal followers framed her as the victim of corporate greed, but locals who had been at the opening posted their own videos, showing the documents on the counter and the inspector's visit. The phrase "second best" became a sarcastic hashtag under photos of her menu. Memes circulated, latte foam art shaped like the number 2, captions reading, "Still not first." Even those inclined to support her began to question her judgment. Inside the cafe, staff turnover started almost immediately. 2 baristas quit in the same week, citing unclear schedules and delayed paychecks. A third left after a heated argument with Sarah in front of customers. The space that had once felt lively now carried an undercurrent of tension, the kind customers notice even if no one says a word. Her biggest investors, the ones she'd boasted about securing, grew quiet. Without steady income and with expenses mounting, their enthusiasm faded. A few began asking pointed questions about her lease terms and why she hadn't disclosed the building's change in ownership. I knew those conversations would not go in her favor. Sarah responded by doubling down on appearances, posting filtered photos of latte art and sunny windows, avoiding any mention of the financial strain. But the effort showed in her eyes, even online. The spark that had carried her through planning stages dimmed. She smiled less, blinked more. For the first time in my life, I saw her not as untouchable, but as someone cornered by her own choices, the walls inching closer each day. Margaret had always carried herself like the unofficial matriarch of the community. She hosted charity luncheons, chaired church committees, and dispensed advice with the confidence of someone whose opinion was rarely challenged. But after the cafe's opening day, that air of authority began to thin. People remembered the practice daughter line. At first, it was whispered, half smiling in private corners. Then it was repeated outright at community meetings, often with a raised eyebrow in my direction if I happened to be present. The words took on a life of their own, traveling faster than any defense she could mount. At church, she noticed the shift before anyone said it aloud. Her usual seat-saving gestures went ignored. The pastor still greeted her warmly, but his wife kept conversations brief. The charity board she chaired suddenly found reasons to delay votes on her proposals. Her influence had always been tied to the perception of her as fair, generous, and wise. The footage from the cafe shattered that image. Calls to me began about 2 weeks later. The first was short, a clipped "We need to talk." I let it go to voicemail. The second stretched into a long message about misunderstandings, family loyalty, and how the community could misinterpret things. That one I didn't answer either. By the third call, she had dropped the polite framing and was demanding a meeting to clear this up. My only reply was a short email. Please direct all communication through my attorney. She didn't take it well. Word got back to me that she had vented to mutual acquaintances, claiming I was destroying the family. But without an audience willing to play along, her accusations fell flat. The same people she once kept in her corner now kept their distance, unwilling to get caught in the middle. Even at the grocery store, she couldn't escape the ripple. A woman in the produce aisle asked her, not unkindly, if she had spoken to me yet. Another commented that it must be hard to see one daughter succeed after all that. Margaret forced smiles, but her pace quickened in public. For someone who once thrived on recognition, she was learning the weight of being recognized for the wrong thing. I didn't celebrate her discomfort. I didn't need to. The gap between her old image and her current reality was doing the work. And unlike her staged performances, this one didn't have an exit strategy. Dad's approach was quieter than Mom's. He didn't call right away. Instead, one Saturday morning, I found him standing outside the building while I was unlocking the front door. He had paint on his jeans and an awkward half-smile, the kind that said he'd been rehearsing. There was a travel mug of coffee in his other hand, steam curling into the morning air. "I thought you might need help," he said, holding up a small toolbox. I let him in. He walked the space like a man taking inventory, eyes skimming the light fixtures and scuffed baseboards, not quite meeting mine. His silence wasn't new, but it felt different this time, less like avoidance, more like caution. He didn't apologize in so many words. What he offered was a sentence. I should have spoken up. The pause before he said it carried years of absence. I accepted it for what it was, an acknowledgement, not a rewrite of history. We spent the morning tightening screws on shelves and patching a crack in the upstairs wall. He didn't bring up Mom or Sarah, and I didn't ask him to. Some truths sat between us like tools we didn't pick up. Word of our quiet collaboration traveled. Aunts and cousins began reaching out, their tone different from the usual breezy invitations. Some wanted to get together and talk. Others sent photos from years past as if nostalgia might serve as an olive branch. I responded with brief, polite messages. If they wanted access, they would have to show respect first. There would be no more stepping over my boundaries for the sake of family peace. At the next family gathering I attended, a cousin's engagement party, my name was the first called during introductions. It was a small detail, but one I noticed. Conversations lingered with me longer than they had in years. A few even asked about my art studio plans, without glancing over my shoulder for Sarah's entrance. It was the first time in a long time I spoke without measuring how my words might be overshadowed. Still, I didn't confuse curiosity with loyalty. When the topic of the cafe came up, some relatives fell silent, others shifted the subject entirely. No one openly criticized Sarah, but the absence of the old chorus of praise was telling. It was as if the family script had been misplaced, and no one was rushing to rewrite it. Dad kept showing up in small ways, a fresh coat of paint on the studio door, a repaired hinge I hadn't gotten to yet, a box of light bulbs left on my desk with no note. I thanked him each time, but I kept my boundaries. His gestures were welcome, but they didn't erase the years he'd stayed silent. For the extended family, the new order was clear. Access followed respect, and respect followed action. It wasn't about punishment, it was about a recalibration. They could choose to meet me on even ground or not at all. Either way, I was fine. Sophie Carter's article hit the local news site 2 days after the cafe's opening. The headline was neutral. New owner, new terms, public paper trail. But the body of the piece left little room for interpretation. She laid out the timeline of the ownership change, the lease clauses, and the inspector's visit, all supported by photographs from the event. One image in particular, a still of me sliding the file across the counter, circulated on social media with captions both mocking and admiring. The comments section lit up. Some readers accused me of ambushing my own family, while others argued that contracts were contracts. A handful focused on the second best remark, calling it cruel regardless of the circumstances. What stood out was that Sophie hadn't framed it as gossip. She presented the facts, making it clear that this was not about personal grudges. It was about documented agreements and the consequences of ignoring them. That shift mattered. In a town where reputation could hinge on who told the better story, I had something stronger: a paper trail. For years, Mom and Sarah had relied on charm and narrative control to win people over. Now, their words had to compete with dates, signatures, and statutes. Every attempt at reframing had to contend with screenshots of Sophie's piece. Business owners began reaching out, some quietly, others openly. A few admitted they had their own stories of being pressured into favors or overlooked for flashier competition. The conversation moved from my situation to a broader one about fairness in business dealings. It was no longer a family feud, it was precedent. The local Chamber of Commerce even referenced the cafe incident in a closed meeting about lease agreements, a sign that the story had already left our family's orbit. Even those who didn't like me personally seemed to respect the way I'd handled it. I hadn't shouted or taken to social media with rants. I'd let the facts stand on their own. In a small community, restraint can read as strength, and strength can shift the balance of who people listen to. The cafe's foot traffic dipped in the weeks after the article. Some customers still went out of loyalty to Sarah, but others chose different spots, not wanting to get caught in the tension. A few vendors quietly stopped working with her, citing business reasons. Word spread that investors were hesitant to commit to her planned expansion. Without saying a word, I'd made expansion sound risky. For me, the article was a quiet turning point. It wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about record-keeping. Rumor had turned into record, and record carried weight. Even if Mom or Sarah tried to spin the story later, too many people had read the documented version. And unlike rumor, the record didn't fade. It sat there, archived, ready to be pulled up whenever someone needed the truth. I converted the vacant upstairs unit into a small, light-soaked studio. The south-facing windows let in sun all day, and the hardwood floors, worn but solid, gave the space warmth. I painted the walls a soft gray, hung shelves for my supplies, and set up a sturdy drafting table in the corner. A second-hand rug from the thrift store softened the echo of footsteps, and a line of potted plants thrived in the sunlight like they had been waiting for the move. It felt like the first space I'd ever had that was entirely mine. No one could reassign it, take credit for it, or tell me it would be better used for something else. Every choice, the paint color, the placement of the easel, the playlist humming in the background, was mine. Even the scent of the place, a mix of coffee from downstairs and linseed oil from my paints, felt like part of my signature. My first show in the space was themed, "Practice Makes Power." Each piece was a portrait of a woman who had been underestimated, miscast as a supporting act, or dismissed outright. Some were based on people I knew. Others were imagined composites, drawn from years of observation. The collection was both personal and universal, and it sold better than I'd expected. On the night of the opening, people lingered in front of certain pieces, nodding quietly as if they recognized themselves. I kept the rent proceeds separate from my personal income. The studio funded itself, and I liked the independence that gave me. No investors, no family strings, no favors owed. Just work traded for value. The bank account tied to the studio became a visible reminder that I could build something sustainable on my own terms. People who visited the studio sometimes mentioned the cafe in careful tones, as if expecting me to take the bait. I never did. My silence was deliberate. It left room for them to draw their own conclusions without me supplying a narrative. Eventually, they stopped bringing it up at all. Sarah stopped by once, months after opening day. She stood in the doorway, scanning the room, but didn't step inside. I didn't invite her in. She said something about hoping we could talk sometime, and I told her she could email me. She never did. The studio became more than a workspace. It was proof that I could build something without permission or approval. Every morning when I unlocked the door, I felt the quiet satisfaction of ownership, not just of the space, but of the choices that led there. The light poured in, the plants leaned toward it, and I worked in a rhythm that was mine alone. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. And that steadiness told me the chapter was closed. I didn't need to look back. I only needed to look at what I owned and what I could create next. If you've ever been made to feel second best, tell me your story in the comments. I read them all. And if you want more family revenge stories like this one, make sure to subscribe and switch on notifications so you don't miss the next one. There's another revenge story waiting for you right here on the channel.